Minutes left.
A ver. Ah. La historia de las elecciones ahorita de Colombia es el paraíso de la cobertura, o sea, las elecciones en general, pero lo de Colombia ahorita. O sea, además la historia de Mocus es como fenómeno.
Insólito. Nadie habría apostado que eso sería lo que hubiera pasado. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, buenas tardes. On behalf of the Baker Institute's Latin American Initiative and the Vecinos Lecture Series, I'd like to welcome you to this important panel on the discussion of freedom of expression and journalism in particular. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to Pedro Alvarez and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Rice, and to Michael Cordua for their generosity in supporting tonight's event. A special thanks to Lisa Waqueta and to the Baker Institute staff for helping bring together this extraordinary group of people tonight. The relationship between the media and the government is a very complex one in most regions of the world, and Latin America, as you know, is no exception. In a radio interview by one of our panelists a couple of hours ago, I was asked whether I thought this relationship was a healthy one. I believe it is, as long as we, the public, are aware of the limitations and challenges the relationship poses. A couple of decades ago, during the times of military dictatorships, media censorship and lack of freedom of expression were perfectly clear. Today, however, when the great majority of the countries in the region are democracies, censorship of the press takes a more subtle form, in many cases making it almost invisible to the public's eye. The media's self-censorship is one of the greatest threats of freedom of expression we have today. In some countries, this self-censorship comes in the form of criminal laws against journalists, like is the case of Costa Rica and Uruguay, for example, while in others, it relates to the ownership of media and media financing, like in Argentina or Peru, where some media are highly dependent on the government's advertising dollars. However, you're not here to listen to my views, but to the extraordinary people, the renowned journalists we have with us today. Claudia Lopez from Colombia, Eli Bravo from Venezuela, and Carlos Fernando Chamorro from Nicaragua. Each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to present their views, followed by a 15-minute discussion among themselves, and then we will open the discussion to the public through your written questions. I am very pleased to introduce and honored to have as moderator Patricia Gras, who I'm sure many of you recognize from hosting Living Smart with Patricia Gras from Houston PBS. She is the recipient of 160 journalism awards, 160 journalism awards, including 6 regional Emmy Awards and 16 national tellies. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our moderator and guests.
And guest. I might add that I don't have half the courage these people have. I am so honored to introduce these journalists. They're advocates of the truth, of free press, democracy. They have a tremendous courage, dedication, and passion. I will just quickly introduce them, and then please do read the bios because they're just amazing. Carlos Chamorro of Nicaragua, right here, is the founder and editor of Confidencial, a highly respected investigative weekly publication. He's the host and director of Esta Semana y Esta Noche, which provides daily news and investigative reports. President of Centro de Investigaciones de la Comunicación, promoting democracy and citizen rights. Claudia López de Colombia, one of the most respected political analysts and journalists in Colombia, and best known for exposing the paramilitary infiltration of the upper ranks of government, which triggered a legal investigation of 1/3 of the Congress there. Imagine that. Founder of Electoral Observation Mission, which monitors political processes in Colombia. Writer for El Tiempo newspaper, Semana magazine, and La Silla Vacía, where she also has a blog. Analyst for the New Rainbow Foundation, which investigates illegal groups and armed conflict. Master's degree from Columbia University in Public Administration and Urban Policy. And Eli Bravo from Venezuela, journalist, writer, columnist, and radio and television producer. Has his own radio show in Miami and is a columnist for daily El Universal de Caracas. Launched Radio Global, which airs in 7 cities in Venezuela from Miami. Author of 5 books, including Una Ola Tras Otra, a 2009 bestseller in Venezuela. Studied journalism at Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Venezuela. And so now they'll have a chance to talk and share with us a little bit about their thoughts. So you have about 10 minutes each. Let's start with Claudia.
I do have a presentation that I would like to.
Oh, great.
present.
Fantastic.
Okay, there you go. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be before this great audience and this panel. What I want to share with you today is what's sort of the general context of the recent threats that journalism is facing in Colombia and how such threats have been changing because of our own context. How could I go here? So, the first thing that is important to say in Colombia's context, that's the only country in Latin America who's having still, unfortunately, a sort of civil war that has long for 60 years with extreme so-called left guerrilla groups and extreme so-called right paramilitary groups that have been responsible for more than 120,000 assassinations in Colombia in the last 25 years. Just in the last 25 years. So, of course, if it is dangerous for democracy, it's dangerous for our citizens, and it's also dangerous for journalists who dare to cover and to unveil the sort of operations that these sort of groups do. Unfortunately, mafia and drug trafficking is a huge challenge for our democracy too, fundamentally from the 80s, since the 80s. So, even if we see this chart from the last 10 years, at the beginning of this decade, the assassinations, the number of journalists being assassinated was really extremely high. It was the highest in the region. Fortunately enough, from the year 2003, the reason has been decreasing. The trend is decreasing, fortunately. Last year, we only have one journalist who was assassinated because of his work. Now, if that's the good news, there are still some challenges. Although, of course, killing somebody is something that you can actually repair, so that's the biggest threat, right? There is another kind of violations to journalism work that has been, unfortunately, not in such decreasing trend as the assassinations has been. So the threats, the different ways to try to obstruct the work that journalists do daily is still a current problem that we haven't been able actually to reduce, that is unfortunately even increasing year by year, as this chart shows. The kind of violations, the kind of problems that I'm meaning when I refer to these word press violations is threats to journalism, threats them to be killed if they dare to publish or to say or to uncover something, inhuman or indignant treatment, exile, arrest, abduction, attacks, journalists who get wounded because of their work. Unfortunately, from the year 2008 to the year 2009, rather than to decrease, these kind of violations increased in Colombia. Although this has been the years in which our security in general in our country has enormously improved. So it's kind of a tricky question. Why, if security for everybody is getting better, security for journalists doing their work is getting worse? The second tricky point in here is, well, let's see. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are unfortunately plenty of the bad guys. People armed and willing to kill to impose their own views. Guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups, drug traffickers, corrupted people in the army and in politics. But supposedly, the biggest threats come from these quite strong armies, illegal armies, that are still present in Colombia. The biggest guerrilla group in Colombia is the FARC. This is sort of 60-year-old guerrilla group. But as you could see, the state, Colombia's state and Colombia's society has been able to press the FARC and to reduce them and to weaken them. So they can no longer attack that much civilians, are also journalists. So attacks coming from the FARC has been reducing, and also attacks coming from paramilitary groups have reduced enormously. So this is the second tricky point. Why the biggest bad guys are in this decreasing trend, or either obstructing or threatening or even killing journalism, and still violations, obstructions for journalists to exercise journalism is still increasing. So who's doing the work? Right? Well, the FLIP, which is this, all this data is coming from the FLIP, this Fundación para la Libertad de Prensa, is the Freedom for Press Foundation in Colombia. It's an association of journalists who, since some years ago, has been collecting data and analyzing the kind of threats that journalism has in Colombia. And they have been able, jointly with the government, to come up with this data for 2009, which is the presumptive author of these kind of violations and problems to exercise journalism. So as you could see, FARC is only 3%, drug traffickers are 3%, paramilitaries are 6%, which means they together account for less than 15% of the total violations against journalism. 32%, 1 out of 3 of the violations against journalism, we don't know exactly who do that. But we know that army or police members account for as many violations as illegal groups. That should not be the case in a democracy. Public officers account for 25%. Individuals who have no public position for 15%. Politicians, 1%. So this is people who's not supposed to be illegal, who's not supposed to be a drug trafficker, or people in a clandestine business. It's people actually holding office or public positions, or at least, if not public, influential positions. So the tricky question is, why they do that? Why they sort of fear such much journalism in Colombia? Well, that's the sort of the issue that we have been trying to research in the last 4 to 5 years, trying to figure out why this is the case. And to put it in a simple, maybe too much simple statement, when illegal and mafia groups are systematically able and successful in capturing politics and state positions and institutional positions, they became apparently public officers, politicians, holding different positions. This is supposed to be legal people, but actually they got to power because of their links or support of illegal groups. So this is people who's holding influential positions, but actually having at the same time strong links with illegal positions and illegal actors. This is the kind of people that terribly care about their reputation. Because a strong part of their position and their power and their influence is that they can pretend that they are legal, is that they can pretend that they come to power legally. If somebody unveils that and puts them into the light of being just another illegal guy, they really lose power. And that's why they are so afraid to this. So that's unfortunately what has been happening. Just to give you an idea what this means in Colombia, by the year 1982, we have the first clear historic reference of an illegal actor becoming elected in Colombia. Pablo Escobar may be the most well-known drug trafficker, the biggest mafia boss, the boss of the cartel of Medellin at that time. He was elected himself, member of the House of Representatives in the year 1982. I do have this number. He got 16,650 votes in 1982. At that time, it represented around less than 0.2% of the total votes of the Congress to be elected, a Congress member. By the 2002, with the scandal known as parapolitics, this fact through which paramilitary groups impose members in Congress, we discovered with different journalists, and also it has been proven in court, this is no longer an hypothesis, but a proven fact, that roughly 35% of Congress members of Colombia elected in 2002 were imposed by mafia and paramilitary groups through illegal methods, through armed coercion, through fraud. So that's the issue. You do have drug traffickers, paramilitary groups. I'm not going to go into the details because I don't have more time now. They have been very influential in different elections, national and regional and local elections, since 1994, mostly, to 2002, up to the point in which they were able to build a coalition of 35% of the Senate members in 2002. And these Senate members were able to become part of the government coalition, which makes them more stronger. Because in the Congress as a whole, they are only 1 out of 3. But in the government coalition as a whole, they are 1 out of 2, which means they are much more influential, able to push for different laws, to get different positions, so on and so forth. We know now, in the last 2 years, we have been able to uncover, mostly because of Semana and Noticias Uno and Daniel Coronel and some very courageous journalists, that the main institution involved, public institution involved in threatening, wiretapping illegally journalists has been the DAS. The DAS in Colombia is like a combination of the FBI and the CIA. It's quite a powerful combination. So why they did this? Because this illegal coalition of paramilitary members were able to push to enforce that one of his guys, Jorge Noguera, was elected as director of the DAS. So he got there, and also from another fraction of the paramilitary group, they were able to impose also the DAS deputy. So they used these positions not to protect journalists, precisely, right? So that's why these strange things and these tricky equations that I was pointing out before. So the DAS, which is the current, I will say, if you see the reports of the Inter-American Court, of the Freedom for Press Foundation in Colombia, the different reports regarding freedom of press in Colombia and threats to freedom of press in Colombia, are talking right now about the espionage, are talking right now, even the DAS built and developed a manual to threat journalists, to make it in an organized procedure, right, systematic. Specific plans to use intelligence collected illegally through wiretapping and through the infiltration of security schemes of journalists, to build plans to discredit the journalists that they were supposed to be protecting. So all this is happening not only through illegal things, and not by some lower rank member that somebody pay and get into this business. They were the biggest bosses, the highest ranked positions, who actually were leading these kind of procedures. And the second thing that I wanted to point out of the sort of the threats that we're having now is that, as Patricia mentioned in the introduction, this problem of conflict of interest is a fact that journalism has to be done through market economy and private funding. And that is not a problem specifically because of that. That's okay. The problem is if you get enterprising and private money and also political interest at the same time doing journalism, the less you're going to have is a conflict of interest. How to manage that conflict of interest? How to balance the private interest of running a business, but also the public interest of providing information to the public in a truthful manner. So this conflict of interest, in my opinion, in Colombia and in general in the region, is not really well managed. And it is being conducive to self-censorship. People don't rather to go into things that could be problematic for their own business or for their own political interest. So I will leave the explanation there, not to take too much time. Thank you very much.
Eli Bravo de Venezuela.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Claudia. It's an honor being here. Thank you very much. I will pick up something that Claudia just mentioned, is that journalism has to be practiced in a market, a free market structure. You have a private enterprise that is competing not just for money to keep on running the business, but also you are competing for audiences. Well, in Venezuela, we can say that there are many things happening at the same time. We have a very polarized and difficult situation. But there is one big narrative happening with media right now and journalism, and is, I would say, the battle, even though the word has a very strong connotation, the battle between the private media and the government media. And what have happened in the last 12 years is that the government media, fueled by money assigned specifically for what is supposed to be public interest information, have become a propaganda machine against the private media, which is supposed to serve the community and has become the opposition voice. This has been terrible for journalism in the first hand, because journalism shouldn't be about doing something or activism, but should be about investigation, about information, and about openness. But on the other hand, the result has been that the government has increased its participation on the media, the mixed media, or the media mix, and the opposition, and especially the private media, has been losing a foot on the audience and on the public, and especially on the advertising market. I will tell you about a little bit how this works. First, there is the interest from the Venezuelan government to increase the participation of the public on the media debate. The argument is media should be open, everyone should have access, and everyone should be able to become somehow a journalist or a public opinion leader, which, as in many cases in the Venezuelan situation, it's a very plausible argument. It's something that in its essence, it's a very good thing to do, but then it comes through the filter of the government interest and also ideology. So the Venezuelan government have spent millions of dollars on community radios, community newspapers, international television, national and regional television, and lately has been doing a great work trying to get into social media, digital media, and also trying to get the young audience involved in what it's called the revolutionary message through these medias. The most recent case is what is called the communicational guerrillas comunicacionales, where you see kids between 7 and 15 years who are dressed as a military, and their mission is to spread the revolution in those places where the official media hasn't been able to have any success. On the other hand, you have the private media, which is a media that's struggling to keep their audience but also their financing. And this media is facing first an institutional attack in the face of regulatory institutions, regulatory arms of the government. Then you have the problem about the censorship and auto-censorship, which Claudia just mentioned. In the Venezuelan case, it's not just about fear for your life, which happened, but it's not as clear as with the mafias in Colombia, but it's more about your safety in terms of your job. You might lose your job if you get into problems with the government. And the reason why, especially in the last 3 years, is that the government might not attack you directly, but they will try to force, in the case of radio and TV, to get you out. And the argument they will hold, more than the argument, the stick they will hold, is that as in good, all around the world, radio and TV is not you don't own the airwaves. It's a concession that the government gives you. And last year, the government closed 34 radio stations as a good way to telling everyone, if you don't control your people and if you keep attacking the government, we can enforce the law and we can take the concession out of your hands. These things happen in a very bizarre way in Venezuela. I don't know if you had any chance to listen or see President Hugo Chavez, the way he conducts his public meetings or all his radio shows and TV shows, which he has one every Sunday. But usually the way he faces the situation is very straightforward, and his minister, they do the same. The National Telecommunication Commission, CONATEL, is held by one of his strongest supporters, Diosdado Cabello. He comes from the army. He was one of his companions when he attempted a coup d'etat in the 90s. And he said once, I have 150 radio stations listed on my desk, and we will start checking each one of those stations to decide which one is legal or not. And I'm sure that we can get to a solution in this argument that we have with the media, because I'm sure everybody will understand what's better for their business and for the country. With this statement on the public television, the government television, the message was clear. Who holds the power right now, and is the government, holds, of course, the airwaves. And if someone goes against the government, they will lose it. And there's a third part, which is a trend in the continent and has become very clear in Venezuela, and is the use of the laws, the Constitution and all the laws to prosecute journalists and also try to close, it might be a program, a station, or get a journalist in jail. There is an editor from a very combative newspaper in Venezuela called Teodoro Petkov, and he always says that Chavez is a man who knows how to play with like two pedals, the democratic pedal and the authoritarian pedal. And he goes, pressing one or the other depending on what he needs. In the last 12 years, there have been a lot of changes in the law. Things like disrespect for the president can become in court a 15 to 20 years prison term. Or you can have issues like vilipendio. This is a word I was trying to get the SAG translation, but you can say something about a public officer which is disrespectful, and this person can open a legal process against you, and this might become a 5 to 7 years term in jail. So these have been a very effective way of saying, I'm not prosecuting anyone for political reasons, I'm just applying what is written in the law. This process that has been happening in Venezuela, how government has been gaining more power using the institutions and the money they have against the private and civil sector, you can translate that to other areas right now. It could be the industrial sector, can be, commerce, can be almost anything, even education. This is like the big trend that's happening. And journalists have been caught in the middle of this war between government, owners of big medias, and their commitment with trying to reveal to the public inside Venezuela, but also outside Venezuela, what's happening. People sometimes ask, is what's happening now in Venezuela is a dictatorship? And it's hard to explain it that way if you understand that nowadays, in 21st century, the idea that we have about dictatorship might be obsolete. What's happening right now is that we have governments that are using their money, their communicational power, and the law to force a society to go in one direction, and it's closing the doors and the windows to free speech, and the freedom of expression. And just one last thing, because I would like to finish with this. I'm sure we're going to have a very good chat later on. I was, to give you this example. Imagine that a U.S. president, it could be President Obama, it could be President Bush, try to do what FDR tried to do before, like appointing 12 new judges to the Supreme Court. And he chooses to do that, a National Assembly that he controls. The guy in charge of this committee to do the selection is one of his ex-comrades on a coup d'etat, and he certifies that the 11 new judges, they will have clear revolutionary credentials, so they will do the job they have to do. Now imagine this. The U.S. has a national electoral system, not just the states that control each of their elections, but there is a federal board. You have a very, very controversial election with a lot of allegation of frauds. And the person in charge, the chairman of that commission, has been for 2 years saying that he's absolutely independent and that he will guarantee that the results of that election are the will of the people. After the election is done, once the waters have come down, 3 months later, this person becomes vice president for the president. And a third thing that might show how things are going on right now is that you have network that it's the competition to CNN. This is Telesur. And this network, which goes from Mexico to Argentina, is financed by Venezuela mainly. Like 57% of the bill runs on Venezuela. And the idea is to show to the world the other side of the continent, which I will go to my argument that I mentioned before. It's not a bad idea. I think it's good that we have a television through the continent that gives us a different narrative than the one that might come from the U.S. It's not a bad idea. But then you have a situation like what happened in Honduras, and you have this network focused on a guy like Manuel Zelaya and all the process against him. You can, I think, fairly make the question that, are you covering a story or are you pushing for an agenda? All media has an agenda. It will be naive from us not to recognize that. The thing is, first, who holds that agenda? How are they financing this? And who has the real power in any game? Because in any society, government is always much more powerful, especially in Latin America, than any other group. And when you have this avalanche of money, interest, and power running against the people, maybe you cannot say that there is a dictatorship, probably not, but you have an authoritarian regime that is somehow closing the door to progress and to freedom. And that way I think I can explain a little bit what's happening in my country. Thank you.
Thank you. Carlos Chamorro de Nicaragua.
Gracias, Patricia. Thank you to the Baker Institute for organizing this panel and allowing me to share it with Eli, Claudia, and with all of you. I wrote some notes that I will try to follow to make some points trying to explain the situation in Nicaragua. In terms of physical violence and repression, Nicaragua is not the worst case of aggression against freedom of the press in Latin America. Our situation is not comparable to that of Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, or Honduras, which is probably the worst case in Central America in terms of assassinations and journalists that are being threatened to death in recent years. However, Nicaragua is a typical case, more in the line of Venezuela, in which a government with authoritarian tendencies establishes a systematic scheme of economic, political, and legal pressures to intimidate the press in order to generate self-censorship and to control the media indirectly. Why does this happen? I think there are two main reasons. Number one, that the government of Daniel Ortega doesn't have what I would call a normal relationship with the press, which, like in any democratic society, includes contradictions, confrontations, conflict. That's normal. But his view of the press is that he doesn't recognize or accept the existence of independent press. He doesn't allow the press any kind of legitimacy. For him, the press is basically an instrument of the enemy. If the press is the enemy, therefore, he has declared a war against the enemy. When you declare a war, you try to destroy the enemy through whatever means you can use. The second reason has to do with the fact that Ortega's government is a minority government. Unlike Chavez in Venezuela, or Correa in Ecuador, or Evo Morales in Bolivia, who won power through a landslide victories, he came to power in first round election with 38% of the vote. It's a strong minority. It's a very strong minority. He governs like he would be a majority through the control that he exercises in the judicial power, the electoral branch of power, and because of the division and the weakness of the opposition. In a situation like that, the press and civil society become something like the last democratic reserve in a society that is falling under the control of these authoritarian tendencies. Now, the official strategy to intimidate the press doesn't include directly closing any newspaper or imprisoning journalists or imposing censorship through laws. Actually, if you ask Nicaraguan president or the foreign minister if there is freedom of the press in Nicaragua, they will say yes, because we haven't killed anyone, or because we haven't imprisoned any journalists, or because we haven't closed a newspaper. But they're using indirect means, which are sometimes are subtle, sometimes are more brutal, to intimidate and to prevent investigations on corruption and to promote self-censorship. I myself have been the object of some of those tactics, and we have had different experiences, from at one point being exposed in the official TV for almost 3 months, accusing me of different crimes, including being part of narco-traffic cartels. I was also the object of a criminal investigation for allegedly money laundering. My office was raided by force with 40 policemen, and they occupied my office for 13 hours. They took away 15,000 documents, 5 computers. 3 months later, they came out saying that they did not have any evidence or any proof to take us to court, accusing us of money laundering. That's intimidation, or at least it was a tactic to intimidate us that wasn't successful. But there's also the power of money. Ortega bought Channel 8 from a business owner, a private business owner, through a front figure. He paid $10,000 from Venezuelan aid given by Chavez. Probably Nicaragua is taking advantage of Venezuelan cooperation, which is quite important in terms of the figures, and it's being used in a very discretionary manner. It doesn't go through the budget. It just goes. It's open-handed for Ortega, and so he closed. I mean, he didn't pay the political cost of closing a TV station. He bought it. He paid a lot of money, and he did not do that in order to establish a TV, in order to establish a public television or a state television, but rather to establish a private business that is basically an instrument of political propaganda. There is a very powerful, the state has a very powerful influence on radio and television. I think Eli already talked about that, because the laws about radioelectric frequencies are very ambiguous, and they're applied in a very arbitrary manner. So owners of radio and television are facing the threats of not renovating their licenses, or that their licenses will be assigned to a competitor. As a result of these fears, some of the top television channels in Nicaragua have chosen to quiet down their critical coverage of government, or they have closed important opinion programs. Others have not accepted this kind of pressures. There is also a direct pressure coming out from the president's verbal attack against journalists, accusing journalists of being terrorists, of being enemies of the people, of being murderers. The problem is that when the highest authority of a nation has this kind of verbal attacks on journalists, this culture of intolerance is reproduced from the top down of the government and the party of government, and is easily traduced into physical attacks by followers from the government or their mobs or their paramilitary groups. We have had this kind of situation mostly during moments of high political polarization, electoral campaigns on the year 2008, when the government perpetrated an electoral fraud. We had it last week. Last week we had 3 days of violence in Managua. A vehicle of Channel 12 was completely destroyed with absolutely no reason, no explanation. A cameraman that worked for Esta Semana, my show, was also attacked. Fortunately, he was not injured physically. But these are the kind of these are the kind of indirect or direct measures that the government is using to attack the media. But there's another one which is also very important, because it has an influence on the quality of the media. And this is the control of public information. We have a law of access to public information in Nicaragua, but it's violated. I mean, it doesn't work. No government officer has been sanctioned for not abiding to this law. The anecdotes that I could tell you about the fear that some government officers or people related to the government have about talking to the independent press, it's incredible. I mean, a minister was ¿cómo se dice? Despedido? Fired because she gave an interview. And I have been received phone calls from government officials, not talking about issues of national security, but, scientists talking about global warming. He gave an interview for my show on global warming. When he realized that he was going to be on the air on my show, he called the reporter and said, "Please take me out of the story, because if you do that, I'm going to lose my job, and somebody else in my office is going to lose my job." I mean, it's something very pathetic. Now, that is a problem when you are trying to do stories and trying to present both sides of the story, because it has an influence on the quality of journalism that we are trying to do. There is also control of state advertisement, and there is also what I mentioned before about the government economic group buying radio stations and buying TV stations. So, in conclusion, I mean, if you ask me if there is freedom of the press in Nicaragua, I will say yes, I will have to have a coincidence with the government by saying yes, but not for the same reasons. I would say there is freedom of the press, but it is threatened and is practiced at high risks. There is freedom of opinion to criticize the government, not because there is a concession from the presidency, but because there is an important group of journalists, independent media, citizens, and civil society organizations that haven't given up against the government attacks and the pressures, and because we are convinced that defending freedom of the press and the right to critique is the basis for other liberties and must be reclaimed every day at any cost. So, in the balance, the intimidation campaign has had an effect in some business owner of television stations and radio stations. And I think there is also the other side of the story, is that there is a resistance that make possible that we still have an effort to promote transparency, public transparency, to err and to investigate corruption cases, and on the other side also to promote democracy at a very high cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will have 15 minutes, and you are supposed to interview each other, which should be easy to do. You want to start?
Start, yeah.
Sure.
Well, I would like to ask Leah and Claudia this problem that is something that we talk about every day in Nicaragua. Can we do good journalism when we are under attack? If the government is attacking us, if I don't have access to public sources, government sources, should I respond the same way? I think this is a major desafío.
Challenge.
It's a major challenge for our creativity, but it's very difficult to keep a balance when you are under pressure. And I try to tell the people that work with me every day, let's quiet down. Let's try to do good journalism, even though we don't have any kind of access to government sources. How do you do that every day? We do make excesses. We do make errors. We do also probably exaggerate some stories dealing with the government because of this tendency of political polarization. So from my own perspective, and I don't know how you guys are doing in your countries, in Venezuela, in Colombia, it's the same story in many other places. I think that is challenge number one for us. Yes, we do have a lot of other problems. We have to protect ourselves from the threats from the government. We have to deal with the economic crisis, which is affecting the media all over the place. We're not talking about the impact of the economic crisis in terms of reducing newsrooms and access to the difficulties about hiring more reporters or keeping investigative units. Yes, there is another problem. But for me, the most important one is how to keep the quality of journalism in a situation of political polarization.
Yeah, so, well, I wish I could have that answer, but I will say, I will try to follow what the consequences is. At least in my own case, I have to acknowledge that. Which is, it's quite hard to be in this sort of environment, to testify how democracy is used to destroy democracy. Because we're not talking about people who's using arms and weapons and dictators, and these people using politics, law, legal economic power, for most cases. So how can we, this is not a threat for journalism. Actually, we're using, or these people in power is using the tools of democracy to destroy democracy by itself. There was a time in which we could say the story, the baseline of the story was, if you threat freedom of expression, and if you threat that, if you obstruct that some way, you're going to affect democracy. Now it's the other way around. It's because democracy is eroding because of these authoritarian democracies, so-called. Now is democracy doing in this way, who's actually threatening journalism and many other activities. Not to say running a market economy. I mean, if it is hard to do journalism, I can't imagine how hard it is to do business in Venezuela, right? You're investing not only your prestige and your work, but also a lot of money and capital, and right. So it's not. We are not the only one affected. It's a more general problem, and we have to some extent, be able to address the problem in such perspective. I have to say, for example, I didn't mean to be in my life a journalist. I didn't study to be a journalist. I sort of came to the journalism for different, mostly casual reasons. But then I started doing it. I love it. I became sort of a research doing journalist and being a columnist. And I ended up being, actually, after 4 years, I ended up being a democracy advocate rather than a journalist. I have to say, I read my columns in the last 2 years. I was not defending journalism. I was defending the very founding structures and principles of democracy in my country. That was actually the case. So is that a risk for journalism? No doubt at all. No doubt at all. You're legitimately defending something basic, doing activism more than journalism, or doing activism at the same time that you do journalism. And the line is difficult. So I have to say, do I have an advantage doing activism, social activism, being a democracy advocate at the same time that being a journalist? No doubt at all. Of course I have a great advantage because I have voice, I have an audience to influence. Right? It's other advocate who's not doing journalism has not as many advantages as I have if I'm doing activism. So to some extent, what's the line? What's the limit? That's sort of the role you have to take. If you just care about your journalism and say, well, no, I'm going to just fight for this, square that I'm managing on. What about the other thing, right? So to some extent, I think that the way to try to care about it is not only to always, there is a fantastic journalist in Colombia called Maria Teresa Ronderos, and she has this fantastic statement to say, every time you have a doubt, go to the basics, period. The principles of journalism are simple and clear. Always come back to that. There is nothing more to learn. There is nothing more to invade, to create, to be innovative. Principles of journalism are clear, basic, are few. Come back to the basics. That's the bottom line. But on the other hand, also understand yourself as a citizen before than a journalist, if you want to actually address the whole threats that you're managing. That's sort of my experience. That's not an answer, actually, for the question, but sort of my...
Can you share the basics? Because, a lot of people may not know what the basics of journalism are.
No, coming to the basics.
Like the truth, evidence,
Truth, evidence, different sources.
Right.
I perfectly understand Carlos Fernando worry about. If you cannot access, maybe the most important, if you're covering any public issue or any political issue, by definition, the government is a source. So if public officers are not willing to testify before your camera, if they are not willing to open the public sources, because you are not asking them to open their diaries, right?
Or you can come to the press conference.
Or you can go to a press conference because you're not going to be allowed to enter to the press conference. How could you go to the basics of having different sources, comparative views, if you cannot access a source, maybe the main source? That's, for the bottom line, impossible. There is sometimes, at least in my case, in which I will say, I will present this point of view, because I cannot say that this is a news. So I will call it for what it is. This is a column. This is not a story. This is a point of view that I can explain because I have the information. There are other views that I cannot explain because I cannot contrast the information. So sometimes you just have to, if you can solve it, at least can acknowledge it, so that you cannot solve the problem, but at least solve the conflict of interest of the kind of and the quality of the information that the public is getting, right? So, yeah, to some extent you adapt, but that you don't actually solve the whole thing.
Now, I would like to point out something. You just mentioned about the citizenship. The importance of citizens in a society and a democracy. And since we're talking about politics and journalism, I think one of the challenges for journalism is to help the citizen to be their own, I won't say master of their destiny, but that they have their destiny in their hands. They understand how democracy works. And there's the place where journalism can help. It can become activism. It can have bias. But if part of that work that we as journalists do is trying at least to put the questions on top of the table about why things are happening and how the government should respond to them, I think we're doing a good job. Because, as I was saying, it's the case of Venezuela, but other countries, you have somehow like the civil sector of the society fighting a government that is trying to hold and hide information. Simple example, Venezuela has the second highest murder rate in the continent. The Venezuelan government gives no official figures about how many homicides happen every week. There's no way to know it. The government tried for 5 months to have a weekly press conference to show their figures. And after a while, they decided that they were so high, the situation was getting out of control, that they decided not to publish, and that's it. So imagine, how can you make a story about violence in a country when the first and most important source of information is holding it? Well, you have the ONGs, yes, you have study groups, but what will happen is that then you have different points of view, like fighting for an agenda, and it will be very, very hard for you to do a decent job. Well, probably then you have to step back and say, we have a problem here. We have to force the government to show the numbers, and we have to have a real discussion about the problems that we have with a city like Caracas, where you have 153 homicide per 100,000 residents. Is the highest rate in the continent. Well, there's things that we have to talk about. You have to force that discussion. So, and I think that's part of the basics of journalism, because I think journalism somehow what's trying is to open a conversation, a clear and honest conversation in a society. And, that takes a lot of work, and it takes some time just trying to make the citizens a real citizens and not the followers of a government or just person that they can call every 5 years to get their vote and then legitimize a government in power.
Okay, we're going to start with questions. This one says, in the search for truth, how can journalists obtain reliable sources within governments that often contain untrustworthy officials? Which is related to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. Fortunately, technology and information is such revolution. That's the real revolution. So you will be able, in general, to have some other source, some other people working in the issue. The government is the most important, but it's not always the only source that you can. Or, in my experience, for example, actually at the beginning it was very easy for me to do the research about the links between politicians and illegal groups, because sort of the information was out there. There was electoral information for politicians on one hand, and there was criminal information about the legal groups. It was about connecting the information. And it was so blatant, the way in which they were related, how they were manipulating the electoral system was so blatant that using basic statistics, you can actually test that, sort of as a political science work, right? So that was easy at the beginning. But then when people ask me, where's difficult for you to do that. In my experience, has been much more difficult to convince the media to publish the research than to do the research. It's hard to find the information, but in my experience, it's easier to get information, to get different sources, to get different figures, data, so on and so forth. Then once you have the story, I have a style that I understand is problematic. I hate to generalize. I hate to say the black forces, the evil forces. we talk about in Colombia about the evil forces for 20 years. And finally I said, come on, these evil forces has names and identity cards and pictures, and they walk. So you can name it. It's better if you name it, because actually you end up sort of undermining the reputation of politics. So politics is bad. No, politics is not bad. Politics is about democracy. These 10 or 12 guys are doing wrong things. That's a different story. Because otherwise you end up sort of shooting on your foot, right? Discrediting the whole system and stuff like that. So in my experience, in this digital technique era, you may have different ways to get information. It takes longer, it's more difficult, but the hardest point is to make them published. If the government is controlling the media, is buying the channels, is using subtle tactics such as concessions and influence and all that stuff, you actually get censored, not openly, but by self-censorship, because the media don't dare to publish things that may bother the big boss.
Right. I have a question for Carlos Fernando Chamorro. Can you give us some insight on the covered purchase of Canal Ocho by Ortega's family with Alba's money? Why you decided to move out from the channel? Felicidades.
Channel 8 is was one of the private TV stations in Nicaragua run by Carlos Briceño. He gave me this explanation. He said to me, there were a lot of rumors by December that he was making a deal with Ortega's people about selling the channel. So I talked to him, and he said to me that he was not doing that because of political pressure or any threat. He just told me that he did it for the sake of business, because he had a lot of debts, and nobody else wanted to buy his station. And I said, why don't you make this business with a normal businessman? Why don't you go to Carlos Pelas, the main Nicaraguan businessman, or to any other TV station? Or why don't you go to TV Azteca or Teletica from Costa Rica? And he said, because nobody would buy this station because of the legal aspects, because there is a legal juridical limbo, and no formal business will come and do business with me because of the problem of the license. The only one that can buy it is the government, and the government through some front men. One of the most incredible things about this transaction, is that the representative of the state telecommunication institute, the one the agency that should regulate this kind of transaction, was part of the negotiation. He was sitting on the side where those who wanted to buy the station were. The money came from Albaniza. Albaniza is a private company that was made from a joint venture from PDVSA from Venezuela and Petronic from Nicaragua. But the claim is that this is private money. No Congress commission can investigate the deals of Albaniza because it's not public. I know because I have some private information from somebody related with a bank that Albaniza made. They had a meeting in their board, and they decided to buy in a bank certificates from $10 million to make the deal. Now, Albaniza did not buy the station. They created another juridical figure who did the operation. How did we know about? because from one day to another, there were a lot of rumors, and then the workers from Channel 8, they were called for a meeting with the new owners, and nobody would say, I am the new owners, but they all had a meeting at the office of Daniel Ortega, where there is a combination of the secretary of the party and the presidency. And the one who talked to them was Ortega's son, Juan Carlos Ortega. But they will never come out in public. So I spent about a week in my TV show. I work as a independent producer. Okay, so I buy the airtime, and I have the right to sell advertisement to finance my production, to have editorial independence. So for 5 days, I said every day, why don't you show up your face and say that you are buying this channel? Until I was in a situation that was some kind of a limit. They never answered to me. But through indirect means, they said, well, you can stay. You can stay. We're not kicking you out. So I said, if I stay, I will be sort of legitimizing this obscure operation, and they will use me to show me up and say, well, he's here, he's criticizing us, and this is the measure of freedom of the press in Nicaragua. I said, I am not the test for freedom of the press. The test will be that Ortega should allow other stations to work freely, that he should give up his aggression against the press, do that, and that will be the test of freedom of the press. From my part, I said, I'm going to leave for ethical reasons. I left for ethical reasons because I said, if I stay, I will be there just doing business with Ortega. I took the risk because when I left, I didn't have any agreement with any other station. And it took me about 5 weeks to find Channel 12 to be ready to sign an agreement with me. But I could see the fear of all the owners of the other station. I talked to the owner of a very important station who said, well, your show is one of the most professional shows in Nicaragua and Central America, but as long as my friend Daniel Ortega is the president of Nicaragua, I don't think it is feasible for you to work with me. And there you could see the power of the government with the owner of these stations.
Okay, we have a question for Eli Bravo. How can a serious journalist in the case of Venezuela avoid being an activist, which validates the position of the government? It seems to me that this is a vicious circle that only serves the government agenda.
That's a good question, and that's a question that we as journalists ask ourselves a lot. I have to say that I do believe that journalists shouldn't be an activist. And as Claudia was pointing out, you have spaces or ways to do your activism. She does it through her column. I have also a column, and it's a column, and it's clearly an opinion, and I'm doing an opinion piece in here. This is my opinion. This is what I think about. But there are other areas when you're doing reporting, when you're doing interviews, or you're doing any other kind of of piece. Other languages, formatos de noticias.
News formats.
Yeah, another news format where you should have different points of view. You shouldn't intervene on the story, and you have to try to get the news, not your point of view. So that's what I was saying about not being activism, because sometimes it happens, we as journalists tend to impose the point of view that we have. I know the situation is so polarized right now that it's hard not to do that. But I think it's in the interest of the country and the citizen that happens. And that's not happening right now in Venezuela. And my colleagues, we talk a lot about this. Sometimes they feel that they are in the middle of battle. The media, the private media, wants to impose an editorial line. If they are working with the government media, they have a very strict code, and they don't have a space to try to get to the middle, get to the story, do the covering. And just with the facts and the covering, you will see what's happening. That's, I think, is the work that journalists have to do. But we are humans. We have a point of view. What I think is we have to keep that point of view in certain areas of our job. And just to point out something, 3 months ago, something that what just Carlos mentioned happened in Venezuela. The main opposition TV channel, Globovisión, was about to be bought by the government through a frontman. And this almost happened. Just imagine, I don't know if we can do some fiction, but imagine Barack Obama calling, hey, Joe, call Robert Murdoch, see if he wants to sell. You know, that things happen. In this case, it's just the difference. One of the main shareholders in this TV station in Globovision is a banker. And in the midst of a banking crisis, he was under a lot of pressure. And the rumor is that he got a call saying, try to move this business on, this sell on, and we don't close your bank. But otherwise, we will go after you. Things happen. No one is sure exactly what happened. But at the end of the day, the channel stayed on the shareholder's hand. But the news director was fired. And everyone comments, and you can see on the screen that even though they're still doing a very courageous job, the tone has come down. So this is I would say the environment where media is working.
You just talked about the lack of freedom in the Latin American media. What is your opinion of the American media? The three of you. Whoever wants to take it. It's a loaded question, right?
I don't really know.
You don't know enough about.
No.
Well, I live in Miami, and I've been living here in the country for 10 years, and I've been doing my work between Venezuela and here in the States. So probably I can comment about that because always, of course, I follow the American news. I think the journalism that's been done here is a good journalism. It's under a lot of pressure, different pressures. The first one is that it's moving through a more polarized environment, and I'm really worried about this. This idea that you have to choose between left and right, Fox and MSNBC, and that, if you are either a patriot or not, if you think this or that, this is catching a hold in the American society, and the media is somehow playing that game. One clear example of what this is causing to news. CNN is sinking. It's sinking badly. Why? Well, because they are trying to do analytical journalism. You might not agree with this if you don't like the channel, but they are trying to be the more clear and balanced possible. It's not working. Fox and MSNBC are flying right now. What is telling you? Well, we have a very difficult job because it's not that we want to tell the stories and that's it. We have to sell those stories. And if the public is not following them, then no one will invest on the kind of journalism you are doing. So that's the first thing, polarizing a polarized society. The second thing is that sometimes journalism here in the States doesn't go deep to the very the investigation, the end of it. Jon Stewart likes to laugh at this every night. No? And sometimes I agree with him. Sometimes I think he's, more of a comedian. That's what he is. But also he's playing on the safe side. It's always easier to tell the story after it happened. The difficult thing is, doing the job at the time. But he always say, why don't you journalists do the right questions at the right time? What's happening? What's happening with you? Why don't you want to, get your teeth there, go to the bone? And I think sometimes that happens with certain media. It could be the political and economic pressure, but, sometimes also the way things happen in journalism are so quick, so fast that journalists can't get deep into the story they are covering. And the last thing is that more and more media here in the States is becoming like a two-way relationship with this social media and the digital media. It's a great, great thing that's happening because you get more sources and more actors in this play. But the bad thing, and this is the big question now here, who is going to pay for the good journalism, whatever you think that is? The problem that's facing from McClatchy to the New York Times to other the big medias, the ones that are really trying to go into the stories, are very, very big because no one wants to pay for the information. Because you have, information for free. And that's a big debate. And I think the future of how journalism is played around the world is somehow, as before, in this amazing laboratory that it's the United States. But that's something that we as journalists have to get an answer somehow to it, and also the public. Because if the public wants, in a democracy, to have a free and clear information, someone at the end of the day have to pay to the journalist to do that job, and somehow that job have to work in a free marketplace environment.
I don't follow the American media in terms of how they cover the U.S. or domestic politics, but I do have an interest about how they cover the world. And my perception has always been that even though, main newspapers in these countries and the TV networks have an incredible amount of resources, even though lately it has been diminished, especially on foreign news because of the economic crisis. But my impression has always been that the U.S. press is very reactive to what U.S. foreign policy is. I mean, who sets up the agenda? In my impression, basically the State Department. The State Department has a point of view about a country, about an issue, and the press goes behind trying to find out a reaction on that point of view. What happens with the coverage? Well, when the U.S. correspondent goes to a country, could be any country in Latin America, Asia, or Africa, it's somehow biased because he has a mission, he has a task to respond or to find out whether what the U.S. Department is saying is truth or not, and what is the reaction. That's one part of the story, but I think they don't go open-minded in terms of trying to find out what is the truth about a country, but they are reacting to what the State Department is saying.
Could you please talk about the role of the SIP, Sociedad Interamericana de Prensa, in the debate about freedom of expression? Why do they talk so often about Venezuela but avoid the case of Colombia and Honduras? Joel, are you familiar with this organization?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an organization that every sort of private media owners belong to.
It's an owners
Newspapers.
It's an owners club, yeah, from newspapers mostly. So that's their point of view, basically. They are defending, they have the business point of view, journalism,
Right.
which means they have to be the actor that play more carefully in how do they relate to the government, because that's a stronger actor in how can they run their business. So I would say they are very shy, actually, to run the debate.
Okay.
I think there are a lot of facts, no doubt at all, to go after Venezuela and to go after President Chavez for the sort of threats and manipulation that he is doing from the media, no doubt. But you can have also a lot of facts and evidence to do the same in Colombia or in Argentina or in Chile or in other cases. And of course, nobody talk about it. The problem is Venezuela, and it's mostly politically driven.
Mm-hmm.
This is a capitalist club.
Right.
So I don't like this guy because he's, doing badly with capitalism,
Right.
but not with journalism in particular.
Right.
I would say so.
Okay. This is in Spanish. I'm translating. ¿Qué explicación? What explanation did the owners of El Tiempo give you when you had to leave? And weren't you very ingenua, naive, to publish your column that led to your firing?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who told me that. You're so naive. How could you be so stupid?
Okay.
There was obvious they were going to fire you. I published a column criticizing my own newspaper because they were blatantly sesgados, biased in a story covering one of their owners who's running for president, and because at the same time the newspaper is competing for the third TV channel in Colombia. So I don't care. I mean, of course, it's a very privileged position. The El Tiempo is the most well-known, is the only national newspaper in Colombia. There is no other one. So obviously to have a column in such a newspaper is quite influential and it's quite a privilege. But I'm doing journalism. I'm not keeping privileges. I'd rather do journalism in other places, in other ways, than to be part of being in this game of taking care of my own interest or sharing the self-censorship of the interests of the owners of the newspaper that I write for.
Right.
So that's not the kind of interest of, that's not the kind of job that I want to do. But my reaction, I was really, I mean, I write, at that time, I've been writing my column at the Tiempo like for 4 years almost. I denounce drug traffickers, I denounce corrupted politicians, I denounce guerrilla groups, I denounce mafia bosses, I denounce corrupted people, and I denounce a bias, and I got fired. I mean, what I want to say is the overreaction.
Right.
I mean, no drug trafficker in Colombia have such overreaction as the owners of El Tiempo had. I mean, that's amazing. Just to see the sort of the debate. I expected for 4 years. I have a security scheme and all that stuff. And unfortunately enough, the government has been able to protect my life from different threats. So I was expecting every day of my life, you know, like the bullet coming from many different places, not from the newspaper. But, well, things happen. You learn your lesson.
Never criticize a journalist, it sounds like.
This made me think about something that an editor friend said once. If you want to think about the perfect dictatorship, think about the private enterprise. What? Yeah, I mean, you want to, express freely. You want to do what you want. You want to have your rights to prevail. Try to do that in a private institution. I say, well, I don't know if I agree completely, but it's, food for thought. And it's true. If we, at least in the sense that private media, they have their interests, they have their investment, and they have their points of view. Trying to manage that is hard. Just think now if you work, let's say, in Monsanto, or if you work, I don't know, in any other private institution. I think sometimes we really slam the public sector, rightly so, but sometimes we also have to see what's happening in the private sector. And this is, it's a bigger debate. It probably goes beyond what we have to talk here. But, after seeing what happened with Goldman Sachs, you say, okay, there is much more than meets the eye there. And there's a bigger discussion. And I always go back to the thing about citizens, of how are we handling things. And if we always want to see just what we want to see, or if we want to put other questions on the table and openly talk about this. It's not, to tilt the thing from one side to the other, but there are certain things, aspects that we have to talk. Private ownership of media is something that we have to discuss and see where's the truth behind that.
But I think, to be honest, this is not only a problem of private owners of the media. I think it's also a problem of us as reporters or editors, whatever position we do have in the media, in the sense that we don't like to be criticized. I mean, we are most of the time on the defensive, and I think there is a major structural problem with the media about accountability. I mean, how do we respond to the criticism from the public? I'm not talking about the specific case of your column, but I told Claudia just a while ago that what she was doing, criticizing her newspaper in a column, was playing the role of some kind of an ombudsman. Now, how many newspapers in Latin America or TV stations do have ombudsman? Not one in my country. I think there is one in Panama or in Central America. I don't know many experiences about that. We are trying to promote in Nicaragua through this NGO, Cinco, at least a climate of debate, of public debate on the media. Yeah. And not many people like about that. And I have to say it myself. I don't like to be criticized by, but it's about learning, about debating about the media, not just an issue, something that we like to talk only about us, among us in small groups. It's a public issue, and it should be debated in public.
And I'm sorry we have to end it there. Thank you so much, the three wonderful journalists who came all the way from their countries to share with us your wisdom. Thank you, and for the work that you do.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been an honor.